Good icebreaker to start things off, so shall we rise to our feet and we'll have an opening word of prayer. Deacon Bush, if you don't mind, since I don't have any water up here to keep my throat dry or wet. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Thank you, Lord. Amen, amen, amen. Once again, good morning to everyone. And quick question, does everybody have a Sunday school book for next week? Thank you. Yep. You need one, Miss Beecham? We should have some. Wallace will get you one. Back there in the back, he'll get it for you. But if anybody doesn't have a book, or if you know of someone who's not going to be here today that you want to carry them book, you can feel free to do that. But we are starting. They hooked it last week. Okay. Yeah, but we are starting a new quarter next week, so please get your books and be ready for that. So with that being said, as you all know, today we are in the 13th and final lesson of what we call our fall quarter series of lessons. Throughout these 13 weeks, as you know, our overall theme has been that of learning to honor God, is what we cover, learning to honor Him. And with these lessons, you'll find that last week we went over our theme for unit number 1 and covered all 3 lessons. We also gave you the theme for unit number 2, and we went over all 6 of those lessons. Then we are today in unit number 3, which this is the 4th and final lesson that we have to end our fall quarter, and next Sunday we'll start a whole new series of lessons. But in relationship to last week, as you remember, we went over all the lessons, so I feel thank you, dear, there's no need to go back over any sort of review. We all know about the lessons that we have covered thus far. So today we're kind of just going to go right into the lesson that we have before us. And as you know, today's lesson is entitled Obedience in Celebration, which is somewhat of a misleading title. Because when I looked at obedience in celebration, I looked for it to talk about celebrating this and celebrating that. It is somewhat dealing with celebration, but it deals with it from a whole different standpoint. It deals with really honoring God through, you could say, once again, another sacred day or sacred days. And throughout all these lessons, we have covered many sacred days. We've dealt with the lessons. To go back over a couple real quick, you remember one of the days we dealt with was obedient to remember. And that lesson dealt with that of the instituting of what's called the Passover meal. One of the things we didn't cover in that lesson was actually it was 2 celebrations in one, because before you had the Passover meal, you had what was called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which lasted for 6 days. And the 7th day was when they actually had the Passover meal itself. But we covered that lesson. Then we moved into the obedience on the Day of Atonement, another sacred day of celebration. Because we talked about there are some days we celebrate, there are some days that are sacred, and there are some days that are pretty much both. But we covered how the children of Israel, for them, there was no confusion about what was the most sacred of days, and that was the Day of Atonement. Then we covered another sacred time, which was that of the obedience in feast. This dealt with a feast that was originally called the Feast of Ingathering. Then they called it the Feast of Booths, but we know it primarily as the Feast of Tabernacles. That was when 7 days out of the year at just one particular time, you would go back and live in tents or booths or brush arbors to remember how you had came out of bondage and how you wandered in the wilderness and how God sustained you to bring it is where you are at today. But today's lesson, I think before today's lesson, the lesson of last week was obedience in rest. You remember that dealt with the 7th and final day that God commanded for the children of Israel to take a break, to rest from their labors. It was to remember how God had took you could say a break, or he ceased from his work after creating the world itself. And then also it caused the children of Israel to remember when they were slaves, they never got a break. But here God had given them a break. But this morning we are dealing with, you could say, some other Sabbaths. I call it, we're dealing with 2 other Sabbaths Now, some might say, wait a minute, what do you mean by two other Sabbaths? How are there more than one Sabbath? Are there more than one Sabbath? You find that, depending on what you're looking at, when some talks about the sixth day or seventh day versus the first day. But when we're dealing with the Sabbath here, we're talking about two separate, I guess you call it two separate Sabbaths. They're different. Because keep in mind, the Sabbath is not just a day. The word Sabbath, by definition, it means to cease. It means to halt. It means to stop. It means to be at rest. So we're dealing with some different Sabbaths today. Not like there's any other Sabbath besides what we know as Sundays. It reminds me, I heard a comedian was talking about a particular choir. And this is not Brown Grove, okay? The preacher was saying that this choir sung, let's say, on second Sunday, but they were pretty bad. And one of the trustees went to the choir president and said that the pastor has a request. He only wanted this choir to sing every sixth Sunday. Did y'all catch that one? He said, there aren't 6 Sundays in a month. But that was basically how bad they were. But when we speak of Sabbath here, the Sabbath we are talking about is that they had a 7-year cycle in that for 6 years, you would plant your crops and you would harvest your crop. But then on the 7th year, which was the Sabbath year, you would plant no crops at all. And there's a purpose behind all this, so we're going to get into it. They would plant no crops at all. Then later you would have what's called the 7th Sabbaths. In other words, you would take these 7 cycles times 7, which 7 times 7 is what? Anybody can add in here? 7 times 7 is what? 49, right. So that 49th year was also a Sabbath year. You took a rest there. But also, just by that, not that by itself, is that on this seventh Sabbath, which was 49 years, on the Day of Atonement, a trumpet was blown to start off what they call for the 50th year, the year of Jubilee, which also that year you didn't plant anything. And all this was done for a purpose, as we're about to see, as we're about to get into it. But this was a whole different time of celebration that we're dealing with here. Now, to open this lesson up, we start off with, if you're using the Bible, we're coming out of Leviticus, the 25th chapter, starting at verse 1. And as this lesson opens up, it says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying." Here we have a very familiar saying. We know that throughout the books of the law, we always see where the writing says, "And the Lord said unto Moses, saying these things." We know this writer is Moses, and that Moses is writing this for history's sake. Moses is writing this for clarity. Moses is also writing to people, letting them know that this is God who's bringing forth these words. But he doesn't say, "And the Lord spoke to me" in the first person. He's speaking now in the third person. Not to lift up self, but to lift up God. To let you know God is speaking, but God did not speak directly to his people. He always spoke to what we could say a mediator, and this at this time is that of Moses, because people, let's say it this way, Christ hadn't come yet. Hadn't washed you of your sins, so we could not boldly come straight to God. So at this time, God used his anointed, his prophets and his priests to speak to his people. So Moses was the one whom God gave the word to give it unto his people, and Moses would record it just that way, that the Lord spake unto Moses, saying. And keep in mind, whenever God says something or speaks, he has something to say. Now, some people say, that's an easy one. Whenever somebody speaks, they have something to say, but that's not always the case. Anybody know anybody that's always talking, but not talking about anything? We all know somebody like that. We got some finger pointing in the back, but I'm not going to call out any names. You know, they're saying a whole lot, but they're really not saying anything. But keep in mind, whenever in the Bible it says, "And the Lord spake," that means we need to pay attention because God is speaking, and he's speaking to say something that typically is extremely important. And you'll find he goes on to verse 2, it says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying." Or before we go to verse 2, though, he speaks now from Mount Sinai. God primarily spoke to Moses in 2 places. Anybody know what those 2 places were? He usually spoke to Moses in 2 places. Anybody know what's the first one, or what's one of them? Well, right, as Diggin just said, basically Mount Sinai, as it just said. He spoke to then. What's another place God spoke to Moses at? Really only 2 places he would speak to him at, as far as a place to speak. At Mount Sinai, Well, Mount Sinai's one. Anybody want to try? You're going to kick yourself when I give you this answer. Everybody say, oh. Well, well, remember he spoke to him at a burning bush, but I said, what two places did he primarily speak to Moses? So in other words, whenever he talked to Moses, where would God talk to him at? Usually in two places. Mount Sinai is one. The second place is in the tabernacle. The Ark of the Covenant. Remember he would come down in the form of a cloud and sit upon the mercy seat. Moses would go into the tent. Then he would talk to God and come out and then talk to the people. So you'll see in the Bible, typically when God would speak to Moses, it was at Mount Sinai or either in the tabernacle itself where he would speak. But here Moses let us know that he's speaking to him now in or from Mount Sinai, saying, verse 2 says, speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them. So who is he speaking to? Correct, the children of Israel. In the Bible, as we know, is written today for who? Everybody. But we also have to keep in mind, too, when we're reading the Bible, that oftentimes when God spoke, he wasn't speaking to, at that time, everybody. He's speaking to a particular group for a particular reason at a particular time. Because here you'll find he's speaking now only to the children that are Israel because of what he has for them. Now keep in mind, it wasn't that they were better than anybody else. They were chosen because of the love he had for Abraham to be a light unto the rest of the world. But at this time now, God has a message to speak and to give unto them. Because this is what he has, as the song says, what he has for you is only for you. And this is for something for them to receive and for them to understand. And Moses records it by saying, speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them, when you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. When he says you come to the land which I shall give you, who's giving them the land? Okay, I'm just making sure, because some would look at that and think Moses saying the land I'm going to give you. No, Moses is speaking there because he said this is what God says, the land that I shall give you. Now, you'll find that when they received this land, some people had an issue even today that said that when they went to that land, was people in the land? You had the Canaanites, you had the Philistines, and all other such groups. So how could at this time God go into that land and give it to them? Because they're fighting today over these very same things. They're fighting today when the primary reason is the land over there to this day. So how can they go now to this land that God's going to give them when somebody else is already there? How is that even possible? Time out. One at a time. One answer at a time. What was the first answer, Dick Bush? That's mm-hmm. 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 Great answer. And you don't listen when I told you time out. You gave me both answers at the same time. But he's absolutely right. One is because it's God's land. It's not the people's land. It's God's land. Remember we talked about creation? Who created all things? God did. I think it's Psalms 50 and 10. They say, all the beasts of the forest are mine, as is a cattle on 1,000 hills. I always remember that because Reverend Truett always said, we always said God owns a cattle on 1,000 hills. He said, keep in mind, God also owned the hill too. So God owns it all. The people do not own that land. But another key reason is that it's not that you're taking the land from them. It was their land in the first place. Because as Dick and Bush so clearly put it, years ago, God had made a covenant, which he never breaks, right, with Abraham. They said, I shall bless thee and bless thy people, and there shall be a great nation, and so on and so on. Then as time went on, Abraham's grandson, Jacob, who became Israel, received, as we know, the land itself. And remember, it was divided among all the tribes. But the point of the matter is this. God gave the land years ago to Abraham. But remember, when the famine came, they left the land and went to Egypt. You know what the problem was? They didn't come back. They didn't come back. But God being God said, no, it's still your land. Once you get things straight, you can come back to it. But while they're gone, or while they're not there, somebody else in there is occupying the land. Digging bush? Mm-hmm. 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 Well, to add to what Deacon Bush is saying about the ancestry or the connection between the Muslims or the Arab nations, who was Jacob's firstborn? Not Jacob's firstborn. Who was Isaac's? No, wait a minute. So many names. Abraham's. Wait a minute. So many family trees, such a family tree here. Who was firstborn? Ishmael. And we know who came after Ishmael? Isaac. Okay. Ishmael moved where? Where did he move to? Remember, he didn't stay there. He didn't stay there in the promised land. He went to, I guess that's the east, to the Arab nations. And we always say that Ishmael is the father of the Arab nations. I always try to clear that up by saying partly. Because if you remember, after Sarah died, Abraham remarried and had 6 more kids, which also moved to the Arab nations and helped form those nations. But the thing is, they said the blessings go to the firstborn. So that's what the Muslims still hold to. Abraham is also their father also. And we said that Jacob had how many kids? 13, but how many sons? You know how many kids Ishmael had? 12. And I could go on a lot of other similarity. You'll find that some of the same thing we talk about in Christianity is the same thing for them, but a different people. So that's why the argument still goes on today, and even with the land and with possessions and so on. So you find there are a lot of connections that they have there. But you find this land that they have, God had given to Abraham many years before this. But because of them leaving and going to Egypt and not coming back to the land, you could say to a certain extent they lost their land, but God still had it for them. This is why now he's telling them, when you come back into the land that I will give you, and this is the land that was already theirs in the first place, he said, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. Now we know what a Sabbath means, right? Sabbath means what? It means a day of rest. What else can it mean? It means worship. But what I'm getting at is, the answers are correct, but typically when we say Sabbath, we say rest. I like to try and give a little bit of clarity to that. It just basically means to cease, to stop, not to do any work, as we could say. The reason why I add that in is when we always talk about God and creation, I call it a human error in using anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is basically when you take human characteristics and apply it to God. Because we always say on the 7th day, God did what? He rests. God doesn't need rest. He doesn't have a physical body. But Sabbath also means to cease. What it really should say is on the 7th day, God ceased from his work. Otherwise, he stopped. But he didn't need physical rest to take place. But here he's talking about making it a Sabbath. It also means, as Deacon Hall said, the worship is that this day is going to be, or this time is going to be separate. It's going to be different from everything else. Because why does God sanctify everything? To set you apart for a holy purpose, to be distinctly different. This is why he said this Sabbath shall also be a Sabbath unto who? In verse 2. The very last thing that verse says. It's unto the Lord. So he's basically distinguishing this from all the other cultures. That now this shall be a Sabbath, keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. Now some might say, just read that and stop and say, what do you mean a Sabbath unto the Lord? How can the land take a rest? Because that's pretty much what it says. But he explains himself by going further. In verse 3 it says, 6 years thou shalt sow thy field, and 6 years thou shalt prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruits thereof. But in the 7th year ye shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow thy field nor prune thy vineyard. So basically he's spelling out now what's called the Sabbath year. 6 years you plant your crops, right? 6 years you harvest all your crops. You prune your trees, you pick all your grapes, you do all these things for 6 years. But then on that 7th year, the land, he says, takes a rest. You don't plant anything. You don't harvest anything. You stop right there. Now some would say, wait a minute now, this is a weird one. Why does the land need a rest? Anybody got any idea why land needs a rest? We used to practice it. Well, I shouldn't say used to. We still do in this nation practice giving the land a rest, but in different ways. Lonzo, you have something? Exactly. The land needs a rest to re-fertilize, needs to be re-energized. So what they would do is every 7 years you didn't plant anything. It gives the land itself, because as we like to say, nature take care of itself. The land will replenish the nutrients that was in it. Um, I came up King William, which is all farm, far as I can see. Everybody did things different way, but they call giving the land a rest today. I think they call it like fallow. Some call it fallow. It basically means you don't plant anything and allow the land to replenish itself. But there's no, how can I not tie my tongue up here and saying this? There's no scientific way of doing it. Everybody does it differently based upon what they think is best. For example, let's say, I think it might be corn. I'm not 100% sure. You plant corn. The corn comes up looking great, right? The next year, you'll find they won't plant corn there. They'll plant beans there. And the purpose behind that was the corn takes a lot of nutrients from the soil. And if they plant corn that following year, you've seen those fields, sometimes the corn's this tall. Next year it gets this tall, and it gets shorter and shorter. That's because it doesn't have the nutrients. So they would plant beans the following year, which would put nutrients back into the soil. That's basically called giving the land a rest, as some people would do it that way. Some would say when you harvest your crops, in the wintertime, they just leave it barren and let it just grow on its own to replenify itself. Some say don't till the soil up after you harvest your crops because it dries the ground out. So there are different ways of going about it. Some would say that you would put some crops there to cover the land, to keep it warm, to keep the moisture in. So that, like I said, there's many different ways that they would go about this. Digging bush? Go back and forth. Mm-hmm. Yep, they would do it that way. But many don't do it that anymore because man can become so smart. So what does man do now? You find we have chemicals. They'll bring out a soil analyst, and that person will take a sample of that soil. They'll carry it to a lab, and they'll come back to the farmer and tell them, on your 400 acres of land, you need so many tons of lime, you need so many tons of fertilizer, you need so much pesticide, and so on, which basically put nutrients back into the soil. But also, that's our pesticides and things of that nature. And when you put this into the soil absorbs it, right? As the soil absorbs these chemicals, you plant your crops. The crops do what? They grow, but they also absorb those chemicals. After they absorb those chemicals, the product is harvested. It goes off to a plant. They wash it with chemicals, put all these preservatives in it, and put it in a can, and they give it to you, and they say straight from the field. And we wonder why we get sick nowadays. Mm-hmm. Because all the chemicals and things of nature. But man doesn't give the land a rest as it should. But also this here taught the people a couple things. One is, keep in mind, we talked about this the other week, how we said real estate is valuable and that farmers will use every square footage of that acreage to bring forth maximum profit for himself. But we talked about the children of Israel is the same way. But they didn't plan to bring forth maximum profit for themselves, but also for others. But you'll find that when they would plant this crop, of course, it gave them income. But here's the thing. You're telling me next year I can't plant anything? That means I can't harvest anything, right? I have no income coming in. I have no food coming in. Something to think about, isn't it? But basically it taught them, I start off saying this, it taught them how to budget, how to save. Because a rainy day going to come sooner or later, right? So you better save something and put aside. Especially in today's world. The world is changing, isn't it? You find people who once had pensions and all, companies don't contribute like they used to. We talked about how our Congress talked about Ukraine. We stopped sending people all that money. They're getting too much money of ours. We need to keep it for ourselves. But I was amazed. I said, well, how can we send billions of dollars overseas to help everybody else out? But then Congress said, well, we need to cut Social Security. You're like, wait a minute, what's wrong with this picture? But it teaches how to budget and how to save. Because the rainy day coming. But also, too, it helped build their faith up. Because some would say, well, how are they going to eat? How are they going to take care of themselves? How are they going to get money? For them, there shouldn't have been a problem. Anybody know why? Why it shouldn't have been a problem? All right, next year you're saying, I'm not getting any crops in, right? I don't really have the income that was coming or the food. How am I going to survive? Why was it easy for them? Hmm? Trust in the Lord. That's the best answer right there. Somebody else said something? Mm-hmm. 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 Oh, yeah. And keep in mind, we deal with people of color. Ain't nothing we ain't gone through before, has it? We have not to go through adversity. But here's the thing. I'm concentrating on what Diggin Bush said, what Miss Helen said. But the comment what Miss Helen said is they had God. Remember, they had just come out of where? Egyptian bondage. They came into the wilderness in the desert. Remember what they said? Back in Egypt, we had food to eat. Back in Egypt, we had a roof over our head. What we going to do? But every morning they got up and they had what? They had manna. They had water. So God took care of them for 40 long years when they know where the next meal will come from. So now you're saying to me, you're worried about next season? When it's Diggin Bush said you had time to prepare for it? So it taught them to have faith in God that God was going to sustain them and take care of them. But God said, just as you need rest, guess what? Also, the land needs rest. So God showed how he took care of his people and he took care of the land. It taught them also, too, how to take care of what somebody's giving you. Anybody ever giving somebody something and they didn't take good care of it? You said, so-and-so gave so-and-so a house back in the day. You see that house now? That thing tore up from the floor up. So why they give it to them? They don't appreciate it. You know, Miss So-and-so gave her son a car. So that boy hit everything but an airplane. So I don't know why she even gave it to him. You know, sometimes people don't value what's given to you. But you find that God gives us all that we need. You know, and so here, as he goes on, he says, verse 1 again, and the Lord spake unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, when you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. 6 years thou shalt sow thy field, and 6 years thou shalt prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. But, there's that conjunction there, a word that joins sentences and phrases, but often it means something different is about to happen. You know, it's kind of like saying, I love you guys. I love coming here every Sunday standing before you facilitating this class. Wallace, but everybody going to stop and say, oh, what are you going to say? Because something different about to come. So God, you know, now something different is about to happen here. He says, sow all your crops, you know, do all these things. He said, but in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow thy field nor prune thy vineyard. Verse 5 said, that which groweth of its own accord of thy harvest thou shalt not reap, neither gather the grapes of thy vine undressed. For it is a year of rest unto the Lord. So you're saying now that even the stuff that comes up, I can't even harvest it? Mm-hmm. But see, if you read that way, and we initially think that we can't do anything with the food because of what we see there. That's proof texting in a wrong way. Otherwise, you read a verse and stop and try to explain it that way. That's not what he's saying here. But you'll find there's more to this equation that comes about. But it lets us know, too, that even when you don't plant stuff still come up. You know, you ever seen the fields that, let's say somebody has planted corn, and then they got all the corn up, and sometimes they'll plant beans there. And you drive by it, and guess what you see? Corn is still coming up. So it's going to come up. So God's saying that, guess what? Even though you're not harvesting this field, things are still going to grow. But you are not to go out to harvest it. Now, what he means by harvested it, it goes back to, remember the law he made about when you plant your fields, don't bother stuff on the edge. He said you leave it for the poor and that of the stranger. And when the stranger would come, all they could do was just eat what was there. Don't go out and harvest it. See, what harvest means is, Deuteronomy gives us more detail. It said, don't come out there with, I guess you could say, there you go, GT greedy. But I guess in today's standard, don't come out there with your truck loading up, trying to take everything for yourself. He said, no, you just take just what is there to sustain you and the next person, but don't harvest anything. Digging bush? Mm-hmm. Right. You're 100% right. And that's what he was speaking of. But we know there are probably some who abuse that, don't you think? You have it everywhere. And look how people act. I'll give you a one right now. Y'all remember other year when we initially didn't have a gas shortage, but whatever the gas company was, they got hacked. Remember that? And they couldn't bill, I guess, the companies for the fuel. So they shut the gas line down. Now keep in mind, there was no gas shortage. The problem was, as far as billing goes, they couldn't keep track of they couldn't bill you at that particular time. But gas still was flowing. But since they couldn't bill you, they cut it off, and everybody said, we got a gas shortage. And the thing with that was, they could still bill you, but I got to bill you later. So they shouldn't have stopped it. Do I get my point? It's kind of like saying, Lonzo got $100 worth of gas. I can't bill him this week, but Lonzo, guess what? 3 weeks from now, you're getting that bill to pay me back. But since their system was compromised, they just shut everything down. And guess what the people did after that? There was no gas shortage. I remember people on Broad Street at Wawa Street. They would come up in there. Oh, no, I'm not speaking about folks who overcharge. I'm speaking about the ones who will come there with those big containers you see that they put soap in to wash cars and stuff. They up there filling those things up. And then guess what? Every station said, we out of gas. Because people came in and just hogged everything, and they was trying to let people know there's not a gas shortage. But if you keep going like this, there's going to be one. And end up, we did have somewhat of a gas shortage after that. That's because people came in and you could say harvest everything instead of leaving gas there so everybody could benefit from it. So God is saying here now to his people, don't plan anything. But guess what? Some things are going to come up. And that which come up, even though you are saved, you still can eat of that. Because we see further as he goes along in verse 6, it says, and the Sabbath of the land shall be meat for you, for thee and for thy servant, and for thy maid, and for thy hired servant, and for thy stranger that sojourneth with thee, and for the cattle, and for the beasts that are in the land shall all the increase thereof be meat. These first 7 verses cover the Sabbath year. So he's letting you know there, don't harvest it, but you can eat it. There's a difference between harvesting and just gathering enough to eat today. So he said, don't come out there, in Deuteronomy it talks about, don't come out there with the sickle and start cutting up all the wheat and taking it for yourself. You just grab enough just to eat, and also it's for the stranger. Now we remember why it was for the stranger, right? We talked this last week. Why was food left on the edge of the field for strangers? They had to eat. But any other reason? Why was it left for the stranger? Think Bush? Mm-hmm. 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 Yep. We talked about that last week. You're riding along and we're on a road trip. We want to get something to eat. What do? Yeah. We stop and get something, but first thing we say is, where are we going to stop at? Where's the exit? We reading the sign, or we got our phone out looking, where's the next Cracker Barrel? Where's the next so-and-so? And then we just pull off and get something to eat. For the stranger is, once again, not one of you, but a stranger. And God said, remember the stranger because what? You were a stranger in Egypt. So you know what these people went through, so you would have compassion for them. So he said, for the stranger that's coming by, let something be there. Because they don't have a Cracker Barrel. They don't have a Wawa to stop at. They just traveling. They go, oh, here's food. And we know in the land of Israel, it's permitted for us to get something to eat. Not to harvest it, but we can get something to eat to go on. So God said, look out for the stranger too. Digging? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. It was a law of the land. Like I said, and as Boaz did, he says, you're not supposed to bother the stuff on the edge, but he said, leave a little extra. Because the point was, God said, I bless you, so you're supposed to do what? Bless somebody else, especially when you had the capability to do it. Bless somebody else. All this was done to show that they were distinctly different from everybody else. Everybody else, they was totally different. But that ended really, as far as our lesson go, dealing with the Sabbath year. But then in verse 8 it says, thou shalt number 7 Sabbath of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years, and the space of the 7 Sabbath years shall be unto thee 49 years. All he's saying in there is every 7 years it was a Sabbath year. But if you do 7 times 7, that's called basically, that's 49 years. You had a rest. But it leads into something even bigger. This is still a Sabbath year, but it says in verse 9, then shalt thou cause the trumpet of Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. In the day of atonement shall you make the trumpet sound throughout all the land. Now here's, as Deacon Bush said, you got to save up. You really have to save up. Because what some folks missing this is that that 49th year, you didn't harvest. And remember they said the trumpet sound on the day of atonement, their most sacred day, which was a burden being lifted off you as we spoke about earlier. So now you can truly celebrate this day that's coming up now. He said, because at that time, you blow the trumpet. It was called now, the 50th year would be the year of Jubilee. And guess what? That year, you didn't plant anything either. So now you're going from 1 year to how many years of not planting? 2 years. We did with the Sabbath year, but also the year of Jubilee. So 2 years straight, you didn't plant anything. Now, someone said that's hard. Actually, that should be even easier. Because the Deacon Bush talked about the planting. This time, you had 50 years planning for this one. You know it was coming every 50 years, so you wouldn't plant nothing that year. But it was also called, once again, the year of Jubilee. Because it says, and you shall hallow the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee unto you, and you shall return every man unto his possessions, and you shall return every man unto his family. Now, these verses don't explain enough about this. Anybody have an idea what's happening here on this year of Jubilee? Once again, Deacon Bush. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You are 100% correct. But let me also add to that. Yep, the year of Jubilee was put in place for a reason. Remember we talked about if God has blessed you, you do what? Bless somebody else. Remember last week when we talked about, we said, how do we treat people that are less fortunate or poor? Remember that conversation we had? We said, how do we treat people that are less fortunate or even poor? We talked about that from an individual standpoint. In other words, how do you treat somebody who is less fortunate you are or poor? We talked about it from a business standpoint, or how businesses treat folks. Remember the lesson that dealt with don't withhold the wages from someone overnight when it's due them. In other words, pay people fairly how they're supposed to be paid. Then we also talked about it from a federal standpoint, how the government and what they do to help take care of the people. You know, some would call this socialism today, some would call it capitalism, whatever, and then the terms have changed over the years, because nowadays we look at capitalism as private owners control the economy and do what they want with and so on. Now, socialism, we say the government runs us and do everything they want to do. But you'll find in the Bible, capitalism and socialism somewhat was the norm. It was all about taking care of your fellow man to be on equal and solid ground here. So you'll find that what you're dealing with here is this. God looked out for his people. He wanted to be a way where everyone would be somewhat, I'm not going to say on equal ground, but we all was blessed. They're always going to have some that are less fortunate and some that are up here, but God says it can be more equal. So what they would do is this. If you had to be an indentured servant to pay off a debt, if you were one who had to sell some of your land to pay off a debt, or whatever debt you might have incurred through your life here, you did everything you could to get rid of your debt. I mean, you actually had to do everything you could to pay that debt off. But here's the thing, Wallace. In that 50th year, whatever you had not paid off was washed away. The slate now was clean. You're no longer in debt. 'Cause let's be honest, some people can start off in life good, but they hit a bad spot. And they get down, and there are people out there that want to keep you down, that you can't get back up no kind of way. But God put a system in this theocracy, the theocratic government here, is to bring it to a point where, guess what? I'm going to bring you back to where you were at. And this cycle will go on every 50 years. Now, you couldn't use that excuse. Let's say, well, I'm going to buy this brand new car next week because next month is the year of Jubilee. I ain't going to pay for it. No, it didn't quite work that way. It didn't work that way. You had to actually try to pay those debts off. But it started you, once again, anew. It started afresh. And the key thing was that of land. All land that you once owned came back to you except land that was inside the city. Anything inside the city stayed where it was at. Now, some would say, well, how do I sell this land and now you could take it from this person and give it back to me? Well, this was only done with the children of Israel. So when you sold me that land, I knew one day it's going back to your family. I look at it somewhat of a point of what we call generational wealth. Now, some folks do today, they pass the money on. So in other words, I've accumulated this, but I got in trouble. But don't worry, my son will be all right because the day coming where what I once had, he going to now receive it back. So God put those things in place that once again you receive the land back because it was your land. So what do you mean your land? This goes back to the conversation Diggin Bush brought up earlier. God gave the land originally to Abraham and to his descendants, right? The children of Israel, each one of the tribes got land. That God has said, this is my covenant with you. This will always be your land. So God says, it's always going to be yours. Now, you can go ahead and sell it, but the day going to come, you shall receive it back. So now, guess what? I'm back to where I started. I once was down, now I'm back here. But God put it that way to balance out things. Instead of as we do today, those who are poor get what? Poor. Those who are rich get richer. That's pretty much how our system works. And the way we treat capitalism today is, I got mine and you got yours to get. But God's saying, I bless you, need you to bless somebody else. And not only bless those of your own, he said, keep something too for the stranger that's passing through the land to show that you are distinct, different people. But you see here where God put a system in place where the once in the land will come back to you because it was yours in the first place. This is what I alluded to earlier, but I didn't want to get into it in a previous lesson when I talked about how, you remember King Ahab wanted that man's Naboth vineyard? We talked about how this man had a vineyard, and it was a beautiful vineyard. And the king said, I want to have that vineyard because it's up against my palace. So he made him a fair offer. He said, tell you what, give me your vineyard, and I'll give you one even better. And someone said, why do you want to give him one even better if he already has one better? The one he had better wasn't beside his house, though. He said, I want this one because it's right by my house. He said, well, I'll give you one even better than that. He said, but if you don't want that, I'll give you a fair price for it. Nadab said this, I can't give you mine inheritance because he knew the law. Because, see, this man wasn't of the nation of Israel. Now, he could have sold it to an Israelite because he would receive it back because that was his inheritance or his children's inheritance. But he said, I can't give you my inheritance. We couldn't talk about it at that time, but that all dealt with the law. It's saying of your people. Now, keep in mind, you couldn't go outside Israel and sell it to somebody else and then say years later, that's my land, give it back. No. He said, I'm speaking, remember the very beginning, to the children of Israel. This is what you ought to do among yourselves. So in other words, they looked out for each other. You know, our people did that at one point, didn't it? We bought of heirs. We frequented our own businesses. We built ourselves up. Well, things fell apart later, but it was all about looking for one another. You see in the Italian cultures, Jewish cultures, they have their own neighborhoods because they look for one another. God had a system set in place where all things would be this way with among his people. But of course, man changed all that. But we see here where God put in place where this could once again come about. Once again, to read verse 10, it says, and ye shall hallow the 50th year and proclaim liberty, which means freedom, throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee unto you, and you shall return every man unto him his possessions, and you shall return every man unto his family. A jubilee shall that 50th year be unto you. Ye shall not sow, neither reap that which groweth of itself in it, nor gather the grapes in it of thy vineyard and a vine undressed. For it is a jubilee. It shall be holy unto you, and you shall eat the increase thereof out of the field. So God basically said, I'm going to take care of you. The crop's going to come up, but you just eat just of that. And also, everything that you once had that you had to sell for whatever reason, or even if family members had to be somewhat really slaves as far as being an indentured servant to pay off the debts, it's all washed away. So this is why they call it a year of Jubilee. Everybody's now celebrating. The country is now back on an equal footing. Because I've always wanted to say, why would you want this side to do good and this side to be poor? Then you got to take what you have to help support this one. And this one is all they're doing is basically pulling you down. But yet, if you take what you have to bless this one and everybody do good, what that do for everybody? Everybody does good. I never understood why governments want to oppress people. They say, all you're doing is pulling your government down. And that's why people complain, why we got these programs to help all these poor ones to help do this and that. Well, if you take care of them, you wouldn't have the poor. Rich as this country is, we shouldn't have that kind of stuff. We shouldn't have a country where a lot of people don't even have health care. When you have nations throughout this world, especially Canada, full health care. Everybody has it. But the United States is what? I got mine, you get yours. Plain and simple. You know, everyone's out for themselves. This is why I stress so heavily. We've talked about the land, how the people of today, I'm going to close up with this, will use every square footage of that real estate to bring forth maximum profit for themselves. And that sounds good, doesn't it? Bring forth maximum profit for yourselves. But God set up for his people to use every square foot of that land to bring forth maximum profit that everyone could be blessed. The difference is one is about you. The other one is about you blessing somebody else because you've been blessed. That's the key thing we have to understand with that. Now, with that being said, that ends our lesson. And if anybody who just may have walked in, we do have the Sunday school books for next week. We're starting a whole new session starting next week with our Sunday school lesson. So you have homework to read. And then we'll jump into those lessons and go from there. But it's a wonderful series that we have coming up for our winter quarter. So with that being said, the time is at hand that we close things out. With that being said, Digging Bush, if you don't mind, since you opened us up, give us a close there.